Welcome guys! Today's video is not going to be so much a tutorial, but rather me showing you how I would usually edit a picture. So I'm going to do that by taking this raw file and turning it into a picture like this at the end. This is really going to be me exploring the pictures and what I want to go for, and not really caring so much about explaining stuff, but rather sharing my thoughts on how I would edit a picture if I would not be recording. And this is just one of a few pictures that I took that night. This is actually during the blue hour and it was raining very heavily actually. My camera was completely wet, but I just thought I had to shoot that with the reflections everywhere. And you know, I just rushed into the city as fast as I could and I got some cool shots. This one right here is one that I really love. Now these are all quite noisy, and you see I'm kind of trying to share a story here rather than just taking a picture from start to finish, and that's about it. Also love this one right here, even though this is even better, and these are just kind of my favorite ones that I took this night. It's not really a long shoot, it's maybe in about half an hour, but I got some cool shots at least. And yeah, this is kind of just a trial and error. This is definitely not how I want this picture to look. And here is something a little bit different. So yeah, I'm gonna take this raw file for this video just because I think this is kind of cool. You can barely see some people from the long exposure. I shot this at 1 second, f6.3, 23mm and ISO 200. Now, the main thing that I like here is that there is a tram in the background. I also have one where the tram is much closer, but there the right is just completely empty, whereas on this photo right here there is a car, so it's kind of a little bit more interesting. Also, I like the way these people look here a bit more. So anyways, let's get started with the editing, and in this kind of picture there are so many opportunities and so many things you could do. So instead of actually going for one, let's explore a couple of these. Now the first one that I would probably do most of the time is go into the color temperature, make everything very blue, you know. I'm doing a very quick thing here, but I'm just kind of showing you the look that I would go after, go into the tone curve, making it a little bit darker, and then of course go into the split toning and making the lights a bit warmer. And that would kind of be my starting point. Of course I would refine everything here, but I honestly think that's a little bit boring. It's not boring perhaps, but I think I could make it better. So, okay, let's try out something differently. Let's and really quickly reset everything here. Let's go here into the color temperature, and where I was into the blues previously, I'm actually gonna make everything very warm. Now, usually I'm not too big of a fan of these warm colors because I like the blues. It's something that not too many people are going for. A lot of pictures are just super warm, but here I'm going to go very warm actually. Nothing too crazy, but I think around, yeah, this kind of look, and then go right away into the split toning, go here to the highlights and make them even warmer. Now I do that so especially, you know, all of these lamps and lights are more pronounced in terms of the color, no matter what I do as the next step, because I want to go to the shadows and bring back some of these blues. And I think I'm gonna go for kind of a cinematic look. Now I'm always liking to go into 100 saturation first, because then I can really fine tune the exact hue. And this is, for example, a little bit too purplish, so I'm gonna go just a tiny bit to the left, then zoom out again to see my entire picture, and then play around with the saturation levels. So I really think I can actually go, okay, you know what, I think I'm gonna go around 70 here, which is definitely a lot, but nothing too crazy. As you see from before any split toning, or yeah, split toning from before to after, this is definitely a little bit more interesting while being not too crazily different. So what I think I'm gonna do now is definitely make the entire picture just a little bit more inviting, less contrasty, less dark, because I don't want to go for a very contrasty and dark picture here, but rather go for a very soft and inviting one. So I'm gonna do that by bringing up the shadows a little bit, I think, also bringing up the blacks by quite a lot. Then contrast, this is kind of a tough thing. I'm really honestly not too big of a fan of the contrast slider, especially in these city pictures at night. It makes everything too dramatic again. So I'm actually gonna go a little bit into the minus contrast, and with a little bit I mean around 60 to 70. Now you might say that washes out everything completely, and you're kind of right, but I'm doing that much so I can go into the tonal curve, go into the shadows here and bring them down, because the shadows in the tonal curve will just bring down the very dark parts of your picture, whereas the shadow adjustment in the basics just bring down and up the entire shadows of the photo, so in a much broader way. Okay, going down to the tonal curve, bringing down the shadows here, and this is kind of tough. I do think I want some dark shadows in here though, and if you want an overall kind of light picture, but you still want to have some darkness, some contrast, then I think going into the minus shadows with the tonal curve is one of the best ideas. So let's just do that. Go up again, perhaps bring up the blacks even more. And, you know, at the moment I'm really just worrying about the darkness, the shadow portions of the picture, and afterwards I'm gonna go to the highlights. I really think it's much better to first of all go into any slider that has something to do with the colors, then into any slider that has to do something with the shadow parts, and then afterwards into the highlight parts, because there are so many sliders scattered all around Lightroom. You know, you have, for example, the shadows in the basics, you have the blacks, then you have the tonal curve darks, shadows, you have the point curve where you can, by the way, add very fine structure contrast. And, you know, down here, for example, in terms of color, you have the camera calibration tool, you have the split toning HSL, the color temperature, the vibrance and saturation. So even though for most of my tutorials I will go in a line and start from top to bottom and, you know, really go structured, because Lightroom has so many different tools and it is quite confusing if you might not be super familiar with it. But once again, I'm sharing you really my true workflow here, as I would edit a picture if I would not be recording it. So going into the highlights now, because I think the dark parts look pretty good. They're overall very bright, but there are some dark parts. As you can see, if I would just bring the shadows to 0, it would be completely washed out, and that's not what I'm after here. Going to the highlight slider first of all, now usually I always like to bring that down, but let's actually also try to go into the plus. Now, overall, the highlight slider, the basics adjustments, is a very broad adjustment of the bright parts. So you can actually use it to bring either all of the bright parts down. It does a really great job for the lights. So for example, if you want to have the lights be not completely overexposed, but you still want to mix that with some plus whites, then that can really work well. Going to the minus highlights plus whites is kind of my basic workflow, but since this picture is a little bit different and pretty much, you know, because of the road, because it's wet, there is so much reflection and so many bright parts. Especially if I would go into black and white and quickly reset all of the split toning, you can truly see how many bright parts there are. And that's kind of another trick that I use quite a lot, is just to go into black and white, because it's much easier to understand the lighting there, as you don't have any distracting colors. Anyways, going back to the highlight slider now. Alright, so let's try this look minus highlights plus whites. Alright, this is how it looks, and this is also something I do a lot of the times. I will try out, you know, one possibility of 2 or 3 filters, then okay, this is how it looks, then reset both, then kind of go into an opposite effect, perhaps even a bit into the minus whites, and in exchange into the plus highlights, so pretty much the opposite as I did before. And if I kind of forgot how it looked before, I can always go into the history here, and this is, let's see it, I think this is it. Yeah, this is the look from beforehand. This is the look how it looks right now. A bit softer. So I think overall I'm actually in favor of bringing up the highlights in this picture. Okay, so let's get started by bringing up the highlight slider here. But then going into the whites, bringing that one slightly down. And I actually really don't do that very much. And then go into the tonal curve and fine-tune everything. Now, the tonal curve highlights, as I'm sure you have heard me say in plenty of my previous videos, they will just do the exact same thing as the shadows in the tonal curve. They will make everything that is very bright already even brighter, so that can be a great thing if you don't have very many bright things, but if you do, then it kind of be, you know, it can be over the top, and I don't think I'm gonna bring that into the plus, maybe a bit into the minus, but then it looks a little bit flat, especially in this area. So from highlights at 0 in terms and then into the minus, it looks a little bit boring. But maybe if I would go into the plus lights, and the plus lights is just kind of an overall, it's kind of a more flashy version of the highlight slider, if you will. It's almost like a mixture between highlights and whites, but a bit different. I mean, to be honest, I don't know what these sliders individually do so much either. I just kind of know how they look. You know, it's more about knowing how something will affect your picture rather than being able to know what kind of technical thing it does. So anyways, here what I have is plus lights and minus highlights in the tonal curve. Alright, again, I'm gonna take a look at this picture, see what it looks like, then reset everything, go into the minus lights a little bit, and go again into the history so I can compare the two as much as I want. And this is the look from beforehand, this is after. Also, I really love to zoom in quite a lot if I'm working for myself. Because, you know, for example here, this is really the area where you see pretty much the entire picture. All over here is very similar in terms of the lighting. There are also highlights, also shadows. So if you have a picture that is overall not super different, you can just zoom in and then have a much better fine detailed view of the actual adjustments. And you also want to make sure that you zoom out occasionally, of course. But yeah, so comparing it again, I definitely love the plus lights here so much. So let's try to go into the plus lights for sure. Now, in terms of the strength, this is always a difficult thing because it's not all about what looks best here, it is how good will it look in combination with all of the other adjustments for the final picture. What I like to do for that is go into the plus lights, for example, and let's say if I would just bring up the lights, I will probably keep it at around 30, I think that looks pretty good. But then I also want to try out real quick how it would look if I bring it way up and then in exchange perhaps go a little bit into the minus exposure. Makes everything too dark, so definitely not gonna work, but let's see how it looks if I bring down the highlights again. Also, you know, not too bad, but it makes it a bit too boring, too flat. So I think I'm not gonna do any of that and instead go straight away down to the tonal curve and just keep that at around plus 30. Maybe real quick see if I want to change anything with the highlights here. And even though maybe if once again I would just add highlights in the tonal curve here, I would perhaps go a bit into the plus because especially if you look here on this reflection of the headlight of the tram from before or from 0 highlights to around plus 50, it does look a little bit more interesting even though it might just be slightly. But then again, because I know that I want to add some dodge and burning later on, I don't want to go over the top right now because then it will just completely blow everything when I've added dodge and burning. So you always have to kind of think about all of the sliders together, because every slider is going to do something different, and every slider and every adjustment and every filter is going to work best if you think about them all together. And you know, everything is a small part of the entire picture. You should never just go to one slider, think I'm here, I'm at that slider, so I'm just going to go at what looks best. You always have to consider the future and the other sliders as well. I know I'm mostly rambling here, but I'm actually really enjoying this because it's so much more freedom and so much more genuine, and I think I'm able to share much more in-depth information here than in my usual tutorials, because I don't have to share any of the basics here. I'm really just going, once again, sharing my thoughts. So, alright, going into the darks here. Now, darks are kind of the equivalent of the lights in the tonal curve, meaning it is kind of a mixture between shadows and blacks in the basics adjustments, if that makes any sense. It's an overall really good adjustment. I would suggest you to at least take the time to move it around. And here, even though I want to make this entire picture relatively bright, let's actually see what the shadows do. Yeah, I cannot bring down the shadows much further, but I can bring down the darks by a little bit. Just makes everything at least a little bit more refined, a little bit more interesting, while not making the entire picture way too contrasty or without clipping any of the shadows. So, alright, I think that looks pretty good. By the way, there's another thing in the tonal curve that I don't cover very much, and that is the point curve. The reason I don't cover that very much is because I don't use it so much, but especially in black and white pictures, actually, in cities, once again, especially more, it can really work because it is a different kind of contrast, a more fine contrast, a kind of a mixture between contrast and clarity almost. And alright, so now I pretty much have everything done in terms of my basic colors, my basic exposure, my basic shadows. So now I can really fine-tune everything and go on to the rest. And I'm gonna keep it in the global adjustments for now. I think I'm just gonna do the global adjustments and then go into the local ones. But speaking of clarity previously, clarity is a very vital thing for your picture, and for clarity it always makes sense to zoom in. Now people might think, well, if you bring up the clarity it just makes everything more crisp and clear. Now that is actually true to an extent, because if you zoom in and you really see what it does make everything more crisp, but it will also exaggerate all of the textures, meaning that every single water droplet, every single rock will be much more pronounced. And as you clearly can see, from 0 clarity to even a reasonable level of maybe 35, it is already quite a difference, not to mention from like -30 to +100. It's just completely different looking. So the thing is, especially if you have a lot of things going on in your picture and you have textures and stones and light everywhere, then it can actually be better to go a little bit into the minus clarity instead of the plus one. And a good way, I think, if you really want to grasp the concept, is to go into the extremes, at least just to try out. So once again, we're at 0 clarity. Look at the pictures here. I'm also gonna get rid of this history so you can see it a little bit better. But look at this picture. Alright, looks pretty cool, right? But as I bring that up the clarity, it makes everything more crisp and clear. But if I bring it into the extremes, what do you notice? It starts to break down the picture. Now, some people might like this very HDR-ish look, but I don't. Especially if you look here, I think it ruins all of the subtlety, all of the reflections, all of the colors. It just completely breaks that for no reason whatsoever. So this is also a great way to decide where you want the clarity to be in your picture. So let's say you go into my +100, here in the middle it looks completely terrible, but when I go maybe towards the right here to some of the reflections here, it actually doesn't look too bad, and perhaps even better than into the 0 clarity. clarity. So this is a great way to get an overall idea of what you want to do with the clarity, perhaps just in terms of the global one or with the local one as well. Now I'm also going to go into the minus. Now minus 100 is never something you want to do, it just makes everything way too soft, but especially if you have something with soft lighting and soft colors, for example winter pictures, then going a bit into the minus clarity can actually work a lot of the times. Now, alright, this is quite tough because I like so many different aspects. And if I like different aspects, for example, if I like, once again, the bottom right to be a little bit into plus clarity and in the middle into the minus clarity, then it's all about finding a medium spot and a relative neutral medium spot to then further adjust locally the clarity in the picture. So what I'm gonna do here is go into about minus 15 for the overall picture, but then real quick go into the adjustment brushes. Now for the adjustment brush, always want to have feather at 100, flow at 100. I hate auto mask, and density doesn't really matter. You can change that around, but you can also just change around the amount of these sliders you have added to the filter. Alright. Now, what I'm gonna do once again is just clarity, and as I said, in the bottom dry, clarity actually looks pretty good. So let's add some here into the reflections, see how much I want to add by moving around the sliders. Now it can make sense to hold down or press down the Alt key, because then you actually see where you've added whatever adjustment you want to have in your picture by this red color here. Now, okay, I think, you know, that's pretty much all I'm gonna do for this layer of clarity. I've just added some more in this light here on the top left. And now I'm gonna hold down the Alt key and I will get a minus adjustment brush, which means I can get rid of previously added adjustments, and that is really great for fine-tuning stuff, making sure you don't have anything selected with the plus clarity in this case that you don't actually want to be selected, so I think that looks pretty good. Now what I'm gonna do finally is fine adjust the clarity amount, and I think that works pretty good. Now it's always better to start off with not that crazy of an amount, and then maybe grab another filter and add even more clarity over just some even more refined spots. So perhaps just here, a little bit of this reflection. Now what clarity will do is exaggerate the lighting as well. Not only exaggerate the texture, but also exaggerate the reflections and the brightness of stuff. So you can use that as an advantage to make everything a little bit more punchy and poppy, but if you do it too much, then it will start to look unnatural, because it will just, you know, it will be too harsh. Light can really work with some minus clarity as well, because I like soft light personally, but you know, in some cases, especially for example in this window, from before any brushes with any clarity to afterwards, it really works because there are some important textures, not too many textures, and at the same time there's not too much light, so in this case it can work. Don't worry if you don't understand everything, it's all about taking the beneficial information out of it and just disregarding the rest. Like honestly, don't just copy me, it is not what will get you the best pictures. Alright, going on with the editing though. Now clarity, I think I'm pretty much done here. I've just added 2 layers of these filters with the adjustment brush here. So here's from before any custom clarity, here's after, and now I really only have them in the spot I want them to be. And another thing that I didn't mention about clarity is that clarity works so much better in the foreground than in the distance, because you can create depth with it. The foreground and what is close is mostly presumed to be sharper and more crisp, and then the rest, or the faint away, the distant objects, tend to be hazy naturally. So going into the minus clarity and kind of replicating that look can really work, once for differentiation and just creating interest, and second of all to create mood and feelings, and then even third a wall to make it look more natural. For example, if you would have kind of a landscape with some mountains way in the distance, making them not super crisp might work or just look more natural. Anyways, I'm really just rambling at this point about clarity, so let's move on to the vibrance and saturation. Now, this is not something I do think I'm gonna use very much of in this photo, because there is already so much color and I don't want to make it too much, you know. There is something too much, even for me. I do like my pictures vibrant and all, but something like that would just be, it would just be completely over the top for me. So another thing that is maybe worth mentioning, if you reduce or increase the vibrance and saturation, it will not have an impact on your split toning. So as you can see, if I go into the minus vibrance and saturation, you still have these yellows and these shadows from the split toning. So this kind of makes it a bit tougher to deal with as well, but a great thing to do here, honestly, is just to first of all play around with the vibrance and saturation and then go into the split toning. Not something I do too much, to be honest, because I like to first of all get my split toning, but it would just be the more simple way to do it, so just keep that in mind. Anyways, going on here, once again, the exposure. Now, I could make this in so many different looks. I could make this very dramatic and where I have mostly silhouettes and just some light parts, but that's not what I'm going for. I want to have a very high key and not super contrasty picture here. Alright, going further down into the editing, this is pretty much, once again, most of the global picture, most of the mood and color and the lighting is already decided, so now it's all about the fine-tuning. Now, HSL tool, hue, saturation and luminance is something that is very valuable to fine-tune everything. So with that, you can just do something that I do all the time, is go into this little pinpointer, click on it and drag it over the color in your picture, and then you can just move your mouse up and down and fine-tune everything. You can do that with the hue as well as the saturation. You do have some limitations though, because as you just have some of these sliders here, as you can see, red, orange, yellow, you don't really have control over a certain part of the yellow. So it's just about going into a part of the yellow that you have very much of in your picture, adjusting the sliders and going for whatever you like best, because you can't really adjust this type of yellow and then adjust this type of yellow separately without affecting the other one. This is really something I would love to have, but you know, some things are just not possible with Lightroom. You would have probably to go into Photoshop and use masks, and I'm not too big of a fan of Photoshop. I like to do things quick and just in Lightroom alone, even though I will use Photoshop sometimes if it's necessary. Alright, going to the detail tool now. I'm sure you know my workflow here. I like to add around 60 sharpening, zooming out again, holding the masking slider and holding down the Alt key, bringing that to the right. Now everything that is white is going to be sharpened, everything that is black is not going to be sharpened. And the reason why that's important is because you don't want to have sharpening in non-textured areas. If I real quick zoom into 1:1 here, go into the sky. Now I shot this picture only at ISO 200, but on a Canon 600D, so it has very poor low light performance, extremely noisy even at base ISO and ISO 200. But in any case, as I move this masking slider towards the right, you can see it becomes a little bit better, because a lot of it is just the sharpening you see. And by default, Lightroom will sharpen by 25. That is because the raw files are really just raw, and you want to have at least 25 sharpening. I could really never find a scenario where I wouldn't have any sharpening at all, but I prefer to even add around 60 to give some extra sharpening. So 60 sharpening here, once again bringing the masking slider to the right, and you can see it pretty clearly from 0 masking to around I don't know, 60 masking, it just deselects the sharpening from the sky and therefore makes everything much cleaner while still sharpening all of the important areas. Now, you don't have to get that perfect, you can't do it in fact, because there are always going to be so many areas and small things, but you know, you just kind of want to get it somewhere in the vicinity of what is best. So, alright, about 45 masking works pretty well here. Now, noise reduction, even though this picture is kind of noisy, I hate noise reduction, I really don't like it. I mean, look at that, even just 15 into the noise reduction, it reduces so much crispness, so much sharpness. And I don't like to add it unless I absolutely have to, so I'd rather have a little bit of noise. Going down into the color though, I love the color noise reduction tool. Just bring that all the way to the right, and what this will do is get rid of the chromatic sensor noise, so that is not the chromatic aberration, but the green and purple noise in your picture. Now, if you're watching this in full HD, you might be able to see some of this. I'm just trying to find an area where you can really see it well. On this red, you should be able to see it quite good. As I bring that all the way to the right, it just becomes more clean. After compression of everything and of this video and watching it out on YouTube, you might not be able to see everything so well, and I would say if you're putting this on Facebook, don't worry about it too much. But if you're actually printing the picture and looking at it one-to-one, then you will see the difference for sure. Alright, zooming out again, going to the lens corrections, always like to remove the chromatic aberration as well, and I'm sure you know what that does. Sometimes you will just have some green or purple fringing on the high contrast edges, especially if you're shooting at daytime, and then if you just click on this little box, it will pretty much take care of it. You could even go into the manual and go into the fringe here and choose your amount, or go over the little selector and go over the fringing. And you know, you can do that, but I really found that just clicking on this little box will do the job for me, and I don't really have any pictures where it's needed to go custom into the manual mode. Alright, another thing is enable profile corrections, just choosing my lens, Canon 18-55 kit lens, as I pretty much shoot all of my pictures with at the moment. It's a much better lens than many people would probably think it is, but it definitely has its limitations, and I would love to upgrade any sometime soon. But of course, you know, money, and I just don't know if I want to stick with APS-C cameras from Canon. Perhaps I'm gonna go to Sony. For now, the Canon kit lens works just fine. So anyways, down here in the transform. Now, transform is something where you can, you know, transform everything. It can actually work pretty cool. For example, here. Alright, this is maybe a little bit too much, but if you would go just a little bit into the minus vertical, it does change the whole perspective of the picture. Usually you would want to use that stuff for correcting any of, you know, architecture or lines that aren't really straight, but you can definitely also use it as an artistic choice. It's not something I do very much, but there are some opportunities. I mean, that looks pretty cool if you crop that. But I think I'm gonna keep it relatively normal here, although let's just try out that. That actually looks pretty damn cool. Huh, okay. Yeah, okay, I really didn't think I'm gonna use any of this, but going a little bit towards the right in the horizontal cropping, and at the same time maybe just bringing up the vertical here, it does work. It does make the picture look a little bit more interesting, if you ask me. Here's from before any, and here's after. It just works better with the flow, because everything goes from the top right to the middle here. This is kind of my center point, so this kind of just exaggerates it. Yeah, okay, I think I'm just gonna do that. So the great thing about it, if you're doing any of that, you can just click on constrain crop, and it will pretty much just automatically crop it for you and not go too far into anything. But yeah, okay, like, once again, I really didn't think I'm gonna do anything here. But it does look more interesting afterwards. Okay, going into the vignetting. Now vignetting, I do think I'm gonna add some here. Bring the midpoint definitely closer to the center. Perhaps even playing around with the roundness, making it not quite as round. and feather is pretty much always something I like to bring up. So amount, I really don't want to add very much here, just around -7 or so, and I'm gonna go into the graduated filters later on and fine-tune everything in terms of the exposure, but for now I think I'm pretty much good in terms of the vignetting. So now we're finally here at the camera calibration, the last global adjustment, and if you're still listening to this, thank you very much for that. I mean, I'm not sure why you're still listening on this ramble edit, but hopefully that means you find it at least somewhat interesting, so I do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Anyways, in the profile here, I'm sure you know what that does. It changes the entire look of the picture and tries to replicate the JPEG look of your in-camera look without doing anything bad to the picture. You will still have a RAW file, but I think in this case it's either camera neutral or Adobe standard. Now camera neutral, Adobe standard. Camera neutral definitely makes everything look a little bit more even, and I think I'm gonna stick with Adobe standard here. I like the differentiation in terms of the colors. Camera neutral is just, it's not that interesting, yeah, so I'm just gonna stick there. Now in terms of all of these sliders down here, let's just real quick move them around. I'm not gonna change anything in terms of the green hue. Let's see with the reds. This is always kind of a tough thing because it's mostly the small adjustments that will have a huge impact already, and you usually have to think about them because you don't want to move them around too much and then end up with just something that doesn't really work. So in terms, maybe a little bit into the minus blue saturation, but that's pretty much it. Alright, being done with the global adjustments, now graduated filters. I do think there's quite a lot of opportunity for that, but before I actually do any of that, let's see once again at the picture. Now, a thing that I was thinking of at the start already is to crop the picture, and before I go into the graduated and local adjustments, I'm definitely gonna do that, at least try it out. So let's see here, either I'm gonna go for kind of a panoramic crop like this. Now this doesn't really work because it cuts off too many of the houses, so let's see if that works better. This definitely looks pretty good, so let's compare that. Yeah, that's just too much of the sky, but I don't think I'm gonna crop it down to a panoramic aspect ratio. If I would do that, I would also have to crop away some of the bottom, because otherwise it would be too empty, and it definitely, you know, it has its own look, but it's almost a little bit confining, so I like the more aerial look, and I think I'm just gonna crop down a little bit from the top, and that's pretty much it. Alright, going now into the graduated filters here. First of all, I'm just gonna look at the entire exposure. I do think I want this right side, for sure actually, to be way darker than the left, so let's just add one filter with a very soft graduation, as I always say, and see how far I want to go here. Perhaps just bring the graduation even further and kind of do it like this. So the entire idea I have here is that this is kind of the center spot of brightness, and then towards the right it gets darker and darker. I do have to go a little bit further with that filter, also in terms of the minus exposure, definitely bring that a little bit further. So it's always kind of a tough thing with these graduated filters because you have to find a nice balance between the positioning and also the softness of the feather. But I do think that looks pretty good. Now at the start I said I don't want this entire picture to be very dark and dramatic, and that is still true, but I just want there to be some differentiation from the right to the left, and I'm even gonna add another one with some minus exposure over the very right. That way it's kind of a more, you know, even more differentiation, and as long as you keep it looking natural or not too overdone, it can actually work. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of the right side. Now let's take a look at the sky. The sky is kind of boring. I don't care too much about the sky here, but mostly I wanted to keep the rest of the top of the picture instead of cropping it out, because I still wanted all of these windows and I still wanted to have this aerial view. So what I'm gonna do is just take a graduated filter to create less attention on the sky, not less interest at all, by going a bit into the minus exposure. And again here, just have to fine tune the feather or the softness of your graduation and the actual effect. So that looks pretty good. Now in the very bottom, I always like to close out the picture. You can, by the way, hold down the shift key and you will get a perfectly straight graduated filter, but I don't want it to be straight here, so I'm just kind of angling it like this. So it's kind of in parallel of this crosswalk. I think that would work a lot better. And go a bit into the minus exposure, perhaps even go a bit into the plus shadows, because I just want to make it darker. I don't want to make it more dramatic, I really don't. So from that before that one to afterwards, it is a very small difference, but it helps contain your eye within the picture. And speaking of closing out the picture, now I like this left side to be bright and all, but just this very left part, it doesn't really work, so I'm also gonna make that one a little bit darker. Always want to angle it correctly, go into the minus exposure here as well, and also bring up the shadow slightly to not go, too crazy in terms of the dramaticness. Okay, so from before any graduated filters to after, it does have quite a severe difference. Now, perhaps I went just a little bit too far with this last one, and perhaps even this one, so I'm just gonna fine tune everything again, perhaps even go a little bit into the plus shadows here. So yeah, that definitely looks a bit better. So once again, before, after, and now I'm finally gonna go into the radial filters, which are probably my favorite adjustments in all of Lightroom. Alright, so once again, the idea is to make the center very bright, and then as you go further to the edge, make it darker, just to draw your eye from the sides of the picture into the center, but also to create mood, and it just works better in my opinion. So I'm gonna add a very big filter here, and go a little bit into the plus exposure first of all, actually quite a lot into the plus exposure. Now I'm doing that so I can see the overall adjustment, but perhaps plus exposure might not even be the best thing, so let's also try out just plus whites, try out the plus highlights. I don't really know if that will work. I think at the end still plus exposure works the best. Now I really want to make this very bright, so what I'm gonna do is go quite far into the plus exposure, but then also go into the minus highlights, because minus highlights, as I said at the very start of the edit, the minus highlights really help to not completely blow the very bright parts. So you can really use them together, plus exposure, minus highlights. I use them a lot when going over a kind of bright area, where I want to make the entire vicinity of the area quite bright, but not make the very bright parts, such as the lights, clipped or anything. So as you can see from before that filter to after, the very bright lights here look pretty much the same, and if I would just have the highlights at 0, it would be too much, it would be clipped, it wouldn't have any subtleness to it. But by having that minus highlights, I can still go into the plus exposure without destroying these lights. Now I'm gonna zoom out again, and the idea here also is to make the foreground warmer than the distance, because generally speaking, I think it just works. I think there's even some like color science about it for movies or whatever, but honestly I don't know anything about that. I'm just going for kind of what looks best to me. So what I'm gonna do additionally to this filter, where I've added plus exposures and minus highlights, I'm gonna go into the color here, and this great thing that you can do. Some people ask me how I get to add colors in these filters. It's literally just right here. It's just kind of a simpler version of the split toning just for the rail filter. So, for some reason Lightroom won't let me decide any color here. Let's try to close this filter and open it up again. Maybe it will work now, but it still doesn't work. Okay, that kind of sucks, but I think I should be fine by just having this blue right here. So going into the blue tones again, I want to make this entire backside a little bit more bluish, but at the same time I don't want to go too crazy because there are still some lights in there and I don't just want to make everything blue. I want to make it smartly, so I just want to pretty much make the entire background more cold and the entire foreground more warm. Okay, I think that's pretty much it in terms of the, the color of the rail filters. So let's go into the dodge and burning, and dodge and burning, of course, making individual parts darker or brighter. And first of all, I'm gonna go a bit into the plus exposure here, go into the plus whites, and the idea here, what is the idea here? The idea here is to complexify everything, of course, but the actual practice is quite challenging for this kind of picture because this is already so bright. So what I think I'm gonna do is not add quite too much exposure or whites, but just go mainly into the warm colors, and then I want to make it seem as if some of this light from the tram would lead, this warmth of the light of the tram would lead all the way to the foreground. So I'm kind of doing this by having this extremely long filter, and perhaps I have to fine adjust some of the tint as well to not make it too magenta-y. This is kind of tough. Once again, I can go here into the perhaps warm tones and add a little bit of saturation here. So from before that, just one filter to after, I think it helps to create a connection between the foreground and the tram, again, beyond just the lines and the lights being much brighter in the center. I also have kind of a leading line of warmth here. So going on, I'm gonna grab another one, this time just a little bit plus exposure, just a little bit plus whites, and I kind of want to make this entire side a little bit brighter. You can right click and duplicate that, of course. A lot of times I like to mix some contrast with these plus exposure filters, because without any contrast it can kind of look washed out. So by going into the plus contrast, you just fix that and then right click duplicate. I'm really mainly looking at these houses here and these windows, and not so much about the already super bright parts because they don't really need to be any brighter. But I am now gonna maybe, just kind of here, because I do really want to have a very strong center point here, so your eye will automatically go to the center of the picture rather than to kind of, lose it and not go there. I'm not really sure what I'm saying either, but I hope you get what I mean. So far the rail filters from before any to after, it's quite a huge difference, especially in terms of the brightness of the center, but also in terms of the color. I mean, just look how much more clear that separation is from the cool tones in the background to the warm tones in the foreground. So, okay, now in terms of the plus exposure, I think I'm pretty much done. I like to add more in a lot of pictures than I've done here, but because this is already such a bright picture, I just don't need to. So let's go into the minus exposure filters instead, and I do think there is quite some opportunity for that. So I'm also gonna add a very longish filter here, make it relatively narrow, and just angle it according to the building here and actually go in between. So I've added some plus exposure mainly on the windows themselves, but that doesn't mean that I can go into the minus exposure for between the windows. So right click, duplicate, then making everything fine-tuned and really where I want it to be. And you know, the thing is, you can add so much contrast in your picture by just adding minus exposure filters. You don't have to worry about the contrast slider or the black slider or any of that. You can really make everything seem much more contrasty while still remaining this low contrast look, if you know what I mean. I'm really not sure if that makes any sense, but pretty much you can add so much more local contrast, and by having some dark parts you will automatically make the picture look more contrasty while still not having all of the other areas affected by it. So I love the local adjustments. You have so much control over your picture and all of the, you know, the advanced stuff in your local adjustments. So don't just skip over it, really try to understand what it does and then take advantage of it, because it's one of the most important tools in all of Lightroom, if you ask me. Going further a little bit, I do think I'm gonna add some more minus exposure here. Now, the minus exposure is really a thing that you can go pretty much endlessly, because really depending on your liking, you can make a certain part of your picture extremely dark, or even go into the silhouette, and if you do it carefully, it might actually work. But I don't think I want to have that for this picture right here. Also, for example, you know, this road on the bottom is a pretty good example, because I want to have this entire road relatively, you know, not super contrasty, but at the same time I can just add 1 or 2 filters in there, and that way add some local contrast, some local differentiation in the exposure, and it will overall look more contrasty while still having the mood as it had before. Very valuable to add some minus exposure filters, especially if you have an overall bright picture. Then minus exposure filters are even more important than the plus exposure ones. And kind of the opposite is true if you have a relatively, you know, overcast, gloomy picture. Then just having some plus exposure more than minus exposure can work quite well. But I'm gonna add some more filters. There's not gonna be too much more to be done here. Maybe a little bit on these cars, and with the dodge and burning, you always want to make sure that you go with the lighting. You don't just want to go over the bright parts and make them darker. Always think in small parts as well. For example, here, this white part of this van is relatively bright, and it's supposed to be bright because all of the light comes from the left side, but that doesn't mean that you cannot make this backside of the van a little bit darker. So it's all about, you know, going with the lighting scheme, exaggerating everything, but at the same time not going super obvious fake there. And Lightroom is slowing down again as I add these graduated filters and as I add these rail filters, and I'm recording for almost an hour. But yeah, I think just about 2 or 3 more, and that's pretty much gonna be it. So a little bit into the minus exposure in between here as well. And then I'm gonna take a last look at the picture, go a little bit into the minus exposure with some of these left parts as well. And it's always good to have a little bit of differentiation with some of these minus exposure filters. If you have a very large area, this is usually flat and kind of boring. But yeah, I do think perhaps just another one over here. Here it should work quite well, even though I might not have to add so much minus exposure. Alright, so as you can hear, my voice is getting quite bad, and I really think this is where I'm gonna end it. Now, let's take a quick look at the picture before. Yeah, okay, I really am happy with the picture, so I'm finally gonna end it. Now, this is a very long history, and I've edited a lot of stuff here. But this is the raw file, and honestly, you know, I always say like from the raw file boring and stuff, and then awesome at the end. Now, this might be a little bit over the top for some of your, you know, preferences, and I completely understand that, I completely respect that, but I say that sincerely. Just look at the positives of this video for your sake. Look at what you can take out of it, take that out of it, and disregard the rest. I really think that if you've already known Lightroom relatively well and kind of know the basics and what everything does, that this video potentially had a lot of advanced information for advanced editing. I'm not really sure, you know, always let me know, feedback and stuff is very, very much appreciated. I go a lot after your feedback and the like and dislike ratio, and it actually helps me to decide which kind of videos I should make in the future, because I always try to give the best videos for you guys at the end, of course. So anyways, thank you very much for watching. I don't want to bore you too much longer. You're kind of crazy already for watching me that long, but trust me, I do appreciate it. So in any case, take care, keep on editing great pictures, and I'll see you in the next video.